Hey guys, it's Zach here. And something I've noticed quite recently is a lot of Therians and Furries want tails but don't really want to buy a real tail, either because they can't afford an ethical one or they just don't like real fur tails. So in this video I aim to find a solution. Whether you can't afford a real tail or if you just want to make your own for fun, this is the video for you. Today we're going to start off with the easiest, most beginner-friendly tail. For this tail we're going to be using materials that I'm sure most of you probably have laying around. All you're going to need is tape, paper, Sharpies, and some scrap fabric. But honestly, you could probably just use crumpled up paper instead of scrap fabric as well. To start, just sketch out the rough outline of your tail. You can see me adding fur spikes here, but later on I decided to abandon those. But you can still add them, of course. In this step, you can add all the different details, colors, patterns to your tail that you like. It's very important that you do this before moving on to the next step, because once we go to the next step, you cannot go back. Be sure to draw a tail on 2 pieces of paper, because we're going to need 2 different halves of the tail to complete this craft. You can see here that I decided to make my tail blue, which isn't exactly realistic to any specific animal, but I do think it looks cool. Once you finish designing and coloring your tail, the next step is to take packing tape and add long strips along the entire thing. This should only be done with either packing tape or tape that is completely clear. If your tape is only partially clear or cloudy, it won't work as well because it'll hide most of the colors. We're adding the tape all over the tail to sort of laminate it and make it more sturdy. Also, do not cut out the tail before adding the tape. Trust me, it makes it a whole lot easier if you wait to cut out the tail until after you've finished applying all the tape to it. Once you finish applying tape to both fronts of the tail halves, we can start cutting them out. This part's pretty self-explanatory, just cut along the lines until you have 2 tails cut out. After that, we're going to place one of our tails front side down and one of our tails on top of that one front side up. So basically that both of the uncolored sides are touching each other. Then we're going to take the tape and start taping the tails together. You can tape all around the edge to seal it in. But don't close it off completely. Make sure there's a small hole left over because we have to add our stuffing. Speaking of that, it's time to cut out our stuffing. I personally am just using this piece of scrap fabric that I'm trimming down into smaller tufts. But if you don't have that, you could easily just cut up some crumbled up paper and use that instead. Once you have finished cutting up your stuffing, you can start putting it inside the tail. Depending on your material for stuffing, this may be a little difficult. If you find that getting the stuffing to stay inside the tail is too difficult, feel free to slightly tape up the hole to make it smaller. This should help keep the stuffing in. Once all your stuffing has been placed inside the tail, you can tape up the hole. When you're done, the tail should look something like this. Also, you can tape multiple pieces of paper together if you would like a bigger tail. The last step is making the tail attachable to a belt. Take a long piece of scrap paper that is big enough to wrap around your entire belt. Then begin to add tape to the front and back of the paper, just like we did with the tail. I also highly recommend adding 2 to 3 layers of tape. I didn't do that here, but it'll make it more sturdy since this is what's going to be attaching the tail to the belt. Once you finish laminating your paper, make a loop and then tape it together. And the final step is to tape the belt loop to the tail. And when you're done, you have a DIY tail. This next tail is a pretty well-known alternative to real tails, and I'm sure by the yarn you can guess what it is. It's a yarn tail. Now, there's multiple methods to doing a yarn tail, one that even includes braiding the center, but we're just going to do the most basic type of yarn tail there is. To start, take your acrylic yarn and make one long strip. Just for the sake of this video, I'm making the long piece of yarn not the same color as my starting piece, just so you guys can see what I'm doing more easily. But ideally, you would want your yarn center or starting yarn to be the same color as the tip of your tail. Once you've picked out the color and length of your starting yarn, you're going to take the first color of yarn and cut a small strip about this big. Then you're going to tie it to the very end of your starting yarn. Make sure when you're tying a knot around it, it leaves 2 even long sides. Then take one side of your white yarn and one side of your starting yarn and tie those together. It might slide around a bit, but that's okay. Then take the other side of your white yarn and tie it in a knot with the blue yarn as well. And finally, take all the yarn together, loop it around your finger, and tie one knot in the center, looping all of it together. This should make a very secure knot that won't come undone. Also, it's actually a good thing that the knot is pretty bulky. It means that the other yarns we tie on won't fall off. The next step is to wrap yarn around your hand over and over and over. Don't do it too tight though, because it can make the yarn different sizes, and it also could damage your hand by cutting off blood flow. Repeat this process until you have a decent sized pile of yarn. Then, very carefully slide your scissors under the yarn and cut. Be very careful that your fingers or skin do not get in the way of this. And if you're very young, please ask an adult to do this for you. Once you have your strands of yarn cut out, begin tying them on the base yarn. If you're doing this for the first time, I suggest only doing it one at a time, but I've done this a couple times, so I'm going to do them 2 to 4 at a time. You can see here that I'm switching colors. I highly recommend having more of the first color than you think you need, because as the yarn falls over it, it will cover at least half of it up. If you find that your second color is too long, you can always trim it down with some scissors. And there we go, we have a small yarn tail. You can of course feel free to stop right here, but if you want your tail to be extra fluffy, you can follow this next step. Take a dog brush and start carefully brushing out the yarn. This step takes quite a while, and I guarantee you your hands are going to be hurting once you're done. Even just in this tutorial, I didn't brush out the entire thing, I just brushed out the top. But if you want to brush the whole thing out to be fluffy fur, it's probably going to take a while. But with that being said, here is my yarn tail. It's nice and fluffy. I decided to make mine more of a nub tail, but you can make it however long you want. I didn't do this part, but if you want to make it attachable on a belt, feel free to add a clip. All you would have to do is tie it onto the end piece of the yarn. On to the last tail. This last tail is going to be a fake fur tail, also known as a fursuit tail. The materials you're going to need are fake fur, sewing thread and a needle, and some polyfill or scrap fabric for stuffing. To start out, lay your fake fur fabric backing side up. Next, cut out your template from cardboard or sketch it directly onto the fabric. I recommend using a piece of cardboard as a template because then you can repeat it on both sides. Once you've drawn both tails onto the fabric, you can begin to cut them out. Fake fabric cannot be cut like how normal fabric is cut. Instead, it needs only the backing to be trimmed, or else the fur gets cut and it goes everywhere. You can see here I'm using a blade to cut mine, but this can be done with scissors as long as you only trim the backing and go under the fur. When you're done, you should have 2 pieces of fake fur fabric cut out. Next, you're going to want to pin your fabric together. Technically, this part is optional, so if you don't have fabric clips, you don't have to do this, but it will make it significantly harder and your tail may come out uneven. Be sure to tuck in the fur as you're adding the clips on. That way when you sew, you don't have any fur caught into the seams. Next, you're going to take your thread and your needle and push the thread through the eye of the needle to start. Once you've threaded your needle and tied a knot, you can begin sewing. As you sew around the entire tail, be sure to remove the clips as you go. I like to sew on one side of the tail and slowly work my way around, and once I've reached the end of the tail, I start over at the beginning on the other side. I decided to sew my tail by hand even though I have a sewing machine because I know a lot of you guys don't have sewing machines, and I wanted to make this tutorial as accessible as possible. Also, while you're sewing this tail, be sure to leave a hole at the very end. We need to reverse this tail back from inside out to right side out, and we're going to need a hole to do that. As you can see here, I finished up one side and I'm about to move on to the other side. Alrighty, right here you can see me tying off the final knot and finishing the sewing portion of this tail. The next step is to reverse it back right side out. This part can be pretty tricky, but be patient, I promise it'll work. And there we go, it's right side out now. The next step is to stuff the tail. Normally you would use polyfill for this, but for me, I'm just going to use some leftover scraps from when I cut out the tail. That way I don't waste a bunch of materials. Once you're finished stuffing your tail, we can go on to the final step, adding a belt loop. Take out a decent sized piece of thick elastic and fold it into a loop. Make sure before you cut it that the loop is big enough to fit around your belt. And then we're going to glue it into a loop. Make sure to use lots of hot glue so it's very sturdy. You can also sew them together if that works better for you. Once you've done that, carefully apply a generous amount of hot glue onto the inside of your tail. Be extra super duper careful not to get any fur caught in the hot glue as it's very hard to fix. Very carefully push in the loop with the loop side facing outwards and glue it to attach it to your tail. Once again, if you are gluing and not sewing, I recommend using a lot of glue so it's extra sturdy. If you're making this tail just to use for yourself, gluing is absolutely fine. It may be a little less sturdy, but it works for the time being. But if you're planning on selling this tail, you have to sew it. Sewing will always be more sturdy than gluing, and if you're making this to sell, you don't want it to break on somebody. And once you're done with that step, your tail is finished. Look at that. I hope you guys like these tutorials, and if you did, feel free to hit the like and subscribe button. See you next time.